Yesterday I spoke about how wonderful it is to work in the Pacific and with people in Hawaii. And I think that what Kavika just spoke to, and it exemplifies why that's true, is because it's a group of people who are not just hopeful, but they're actively hopeful. They say, we can make a difference. Like you said, you work with the community, you say, let's make a difference together. How are we going to do it together? And so I appreciate you offering us inspiring stories like that that can help us to remember that we actually can move this effort forward. Okay, I am going to introduce us to the next person, and I apologize. I came up here and shuffled my sheets and I lost my, my introduction for Steve Gray, who is the director of the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center. He is my counterpart in Alaska. And Steve Gray is an affiliate research professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks International Arctic Research Center. Steve previously served as the Wyoming State climatologist and director of the Wyoming Water Resources Data System. His research explores the interplay between climate variability, climatic change, and natural resource management. Among his other duties, Steve serves as a co-lead for the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, the IARPC, Risk Management and Hazards Mitigation Team. He was the federal coordinating lead author for the Alaska chapter in the 4th National Climate Assessment. And I open the floor to Steve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, and thank you, Kavika. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. So what I'd like to do is kind of set the stage or introduce the next series of talks that we're going to have that are focused on research that's happening as part of a collaboration between the Pacific Islands and Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Centers. So the CASCs, as we call them, this is a network of 9 centers, with each center being composed of a relationship, a partnership between the U.S. Geological Survey and a university or a group of universities. And in our particular case, we're working together because of shared interest and common challenges. And that's what I want to talk about, again, to set the stage for the series of research talks that you're going to see next. So where all this started is in conversations about the shared challenges of doing climate research and climate adaptation in particular in island communities. You may not think of it that way, or many people outside of Alaska don't think of it that way, but much of the population, the economic activity and so forth in Alaska is actually concentrated in physical islands. So this is a picture of Dutch Harbor, Alaska, on the island of Unalaska, which vibrant culture, long history, many ways, just like so much of the Pacific. But also this is a billion-dollar fishery. So this is a key part of the economy of Alaska, as well as the United States more broadly. So we began talking again about what it really means to do climate adaptation in a place like this, where it's cut off from the mainland, and just like here in Hawaii, everything has to come on a boat or a plane, or it doesn't get there. So very common set of challenges and concerns. But beyond that, or more broadly, many places in Alaska, they may not be physical islands per se, but they might as well be islands because they're not connected to the mainland by roads or railroad. So this, in fact, is the capital of the state of Alaska. Getting a little feedback here. It's capital of the state of Alaska, Juneau, and it is not physically connected to the mainland or the rest of Alaska for that matter by roads. So again, everything has to come in by boat. We get the Matson barge that comes in every 2 weeks with groceries and things like that. Sound very familiar to folks here in the islands. And more than that, we have hundreds of communities throughout Alaska that are not connected by road or rail, where again, everything has to come in on a boat or a plane, and it doesn't get there, presenting again, the same sorts of problems and challenges that you have here. So that's what got us together. That's what got us to start talking. And what we learned is that we certainly shared a number of challenges just based on the fact that we're working in these remote often and very often difficult to access locations. Also, what's common between the Pacific Islands and Alaska is that we're often starting from a place where there's very, very little baseline data to work with, a challenge, a huge challenge in and of itself. Put all of these things together, that means that there's a need for creative solutions in terms of how you monitor and understand these systems. And also at the same time, very much like here in the islands, there's a direct connection between these landscapes and the way that people live and make a living. Now, as a starting point for this collaboration and what you'll mostly be hearing about today is work that we were doing to begin to understand a part of or certain types of landscapes in these two regions. Starting with these areas where we have really short, steep gradients where what's happening high up in the watershed has a profound influence all the way out into the nearshore marine environment. So this is a picture here, actually quite close to my house in Chugiak, Alaska, where what you see is ridges going up to 5,000 to 6,000 feet in just a matter of a mile or two from the shoreline. Very much like what you would see in many parts of Hawaii, or what some of you hopefully are going to see tomorrow with the Haiʻa field trip, and frankly anywhere if you're driving around or hiking around in the islands. This very similar sort of, again, short, steep watershed where the connection between what happens in the uplands and the lowlands is through the water that runs through these systems. So our first goal, and the one, again, that we're going to concentrate in this next series of talks, is understanding these systems and the processes whereby climate can impact the entire watershed from ridge to reef and ice field to ocean. But I also want to talk a little bit about, or plant some ideas about where we want to head with this collaboration. In particular, we're very interested in exploring the social ecological side of these relationships and thinking about what we share in common from a cultural perspective. First and foremost, the fact that, again, there are very strong linkages between these landscapes that we're talking about and the cultural identity of the people that live there. Very often that is seen through food, water, and other resources that these landscapes provide, but also in the language that is associated with these landscapes. The fact of the matter is it's also very important, these landscapes are very important in terms of tourism and recreation for the economic benefit that they generate. And then finally, the fact of the matter is that when you look at the history of the science that has been done in these landscapes, very often there has been a disconnect between the people who live in these communities and the science that's being done. And that's one of the main things that we have set out to address. Then just briefly, again, more on where we want to head with this is that we want to make this collaboration a way to spark cooperation, engagement between researchers, people who manage these landscapes, the people who live here, and the people who are learning about the way that the world works. So make this a part of the educational system or sort of development of these areas. And then finally, something that we're going to highlight, and at least to some degree today, is that we want to also use this collaboration as a way to develop early and mid-career scientists, as well as resource managers that have a strong, firm grasp or understanding of climate and climate impacts in the systems where they work. So thanks so much for that, and really looking forward to this next series of talks. So I'll go ahead and kick it off here. We're going to have two talks to begin with. It's a pair of paired talks by Jason Fellman from University of Alaska Southeast and from Tracy Wiegner from University of Hawaii Hilo. And what they're going to be talking about is work that's being done separately in the Pacific Islands or Hawaii and Alaska, but also thinking about the exchange of information between these two geographies, and also what we can learn from one another about the way that these systems work. So to kick that off, Jason, and thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon. Mahalo for the opportunity to speak today. Thanks for turning out, and thanks for the session organizers for putting this together. So today I'm going to talk about the Alaska side of our joint project with Hawaiian Islands, looking at the influence of streamflow on land to ocean nutrient and organic matter export to nearshore ecosystems. So here's our team, Team Land to Ocean. Jeff Falke, he's with the U.S. Geological Survey and University of Alaska Fairbanks. Ryan's with the U.S. Forest Service. Emily Whitney, she's at UAS with myself. And the two master's students on the project, Kevin and Claire, and they're both at UAF. Today I'm going to present most of Claire's work. On the Hawaii side, we have Walter, and I'm sorry, Walter, with the back of the head shot, but that's all I could find. He's a master's student. He's working with Tracy and Steve, and they're all at UH Hilo. So land to ocean ecosystems are characterized by the movement of terrestrial materials and energy. And it's this movement of energy and materials between these linked but distinct ecosystems that is critical to the health and productivity of them. One of the main drivers of this flow of nutrients, materials is water. So understanding natural flow regimes, how they might be impacted by climate, is important to understand what these linked but distinct ecosystems will look like moving forward. So I'm not going to talk about them today, even though they're really cool, but glaciers in our region. They're a big part of our research though, and they're also a very large part of hydrologic change in the region. And so this figure depicts changes in glacier mass balance that these coastal mountain glaciers are experiencing that contribute meltwater to the northern Gulf of Alaska. And as you can see, these areas in reds and oranges and yellows, they're losing mass. And there's a few glacier systems that are actually in blue that are gaining mass. And so our study area is around that Juneau ice field. So actually, I just saw a paper published last week in the Journal of Science that showed that the mountain glaciers of Alaska are the largest contributor to global sea level rise outside of the polar ice cap regions. So they're a very big driver of hydrologic change in our region. So as far as the climate, Southeast Alaska is likely to experience more flooding events in the form of these large rain on snow events that typically occur in the fall and the winter. We're also likely to see larger storm events in the form of atmospheric rivers. And so literally these are rivers of atmospheric water vapor transport that connect two regions. And the receiving region oftentimes gets these large storms. And so you can see from this figure, thank you, Hawaii, for this large storm that we likely received. And I live at the base of that photo that Steve Gray showed in the previous presentation. So every time I see one of these big R events coming, I panic because water often runs towards me. Anyway, so with that in mind, we posed 3 questions. So how does streamflow influence the delivery of materials in the form of nutrients, inorganic and organic carbon, and aquatic organisms to nearshore ecosystems, and how they might be changing with climate? And lastly, how will these changes be expressed differently in Hawaii and Alaska? So our focal watershed was Montana Creek. It's about 10 square kilometers. And that yellow triangle is our study reach. And so it's just above the confluence with lightly glaciarized McGinnis Creek. And so here are a few photos of our study reach and how it changes seasonally. In terms of our study design, we sampled weekly from May through October. And so this is the approximate snow period where most of our annual runoff occurs. And so we collected surface water from Montana Creek, filtered it through a 0.7 micron filter, and analyzed different concentrations of nitrogen, phosphorus, and dissolved organic carbon. And so dissolved organic carbon, besides being like super cool, it's this mixture of organic compounds that passes through this 0.7 micron filter. And you can see in that photo that typically the darker your water is, the higher the dissolved organic carbon concentrations occur. And so DOC has a lot of different roles in the environment, but one of its main roles is it often forms the base of the food web in both stream and nearshore ecosystems. So we also collected some unfiltered water, measured sediment concentrations, particular organic carbon. So that's the organic carbon that collects on that filter. And we measured alkalinity, and that is the main form of inorganic carbon in our watershed. And alkalinity isn't necessarily critical to the productivity of nearshore ecosystems, but it's a really important part of the terrestrial ecosystem carbon balance. It's also very important to coastal ocean acidification. And we also measured drift, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second, and separate that into terrestrial detritus and aquatic invertebrates. And so what's really important about this is that we use the same study design, same field methods, lab methods, et cetera, as our Hawaii contingent. So we also put a YSI sonde out for to collect high resolution measurements of temperature, turbidity, fluorescent dissolved organic matter, and specific connectivity. We installed a stream gauge for measuring discharge. And this is what the hydrograph looked like for our study period. This is discharge in cubic meters per second. And those blue circles are our sample points. So you can see we have pretty good temporal resolution, as well as a fair number of points at high and low flow. So for measuring drift, I mean, literally, you stick this rectangular net out in a well-mixed portion of the stream, and it's 250 micron. And so it collects what is moving downstream. And so you collect it, you take it to the side of the channel, and you organize it. And so this is what one of our drift samples looks like. And so you can see there's a terrestrial detritus. And I love that photo. This is Lucy Franklin. She's a fantastic undergraduate. She's delighted to collect that drift sample. So you take it back to lab and you process it. So looking at some of the results, so this is discharge on the left y-axis in cubic meters per second, and these are drift concentrations, milligrams per liter. So this is green circles. And as you can see, there are some pretty good patterns, relationships with flow, with the exception of those few outlying points, which we'll probably get rid of. But anyway, so looking at that a little bit closer, so this is what some of the little bugs look like. So here's some aquatic invertebrates collected at low flow and high flow, and you can see there's some pretty distinct differences. Much larger invertebrate community during the high flow, and they get those nice big juicy worms, which are definitely consumed by a lot of the juvenile salmonids, coho salmon in particular, in our study reach. So it's an important source of food for some of these juveniles. And so I'm not going to talk about that today, but we do have Kevin, who's a graduate student working on the project, that is looking more closely at the fish communities, when they're feeding and what they're feeding on. So looking at the stream water carbon and nitrogen yields, or fluxes of carbon and nitrogen. So this is the percent contribution. And so these are the 5 different forms of carbon that we measured. And so you basically sum up all of those. And so these are the percent contribution to the total flux of each one of those forms of carbon to the export. And so with the exception of July, dissolved organic carbon forms the dominant constituent, the dominant form of carbon being exported from the watershed, with the exception of July, which was a really warm and dry period where alkalinity was the largest form of carbon export. Looking at nitrogen, similar to carbon, dissolved organic nitrogen was the dominant form of nitrogen being exported from the watershed. So this data shows that organic forms are really are what's driving the export of carbon and nitrogen from the watershed. So looking a little bit closer at the biogeochemistry, so flow concentration relationships, you can see here's DOC versus discharge, and it's a little bit of a scatter plot. So you look at this closely with a regression and you can see it looks like me shooting a bow and arrow. Not that strong a relationship. So, but look at this a little bit closer. You can see there's actually some pretty nice seasonal relationships between dissolved organic carbon and discharge. So what this tells us is not all storms are created equal. So in other words, if you have a storm in May and you have a storm in September, the amount of DOC exported from that watershed is going to look very different. So what that means for nearshore ecosystems in the last 30 seconds, one of the ways we look at this value to the potential importance of organic matter to coastal productivity is we look at the molar ratio of carbon and nitrogen, or the stoichiometric ratio. And so these are a few main forms of organic matter. And as you can see, there's a big difference in the C to N ratio. So even though dissolved organic carbon is the dominant form of carbon being exported from that watershed, it's actually the lowest quality. And so you have this system that's pumping out this DOC in large amounts, but it's the lowest quality. And then you have these forms of carbon, there's not that much of it there, but it's a much higher quality. So what does that mean? And this is Sonia Nagorski. She's asking that question. So real quickly, our preliminary research is really showing that hydrology is a big driver on when and how materials are being exported, and it is likely to change in the future. So what does that mean? It's a good question. So with that, thanks. I could have talked a lot longer, but
thank you very much, Jason. We'll do a Q&A session, or a quick Q&A after the next talk in the pair. So welcome now, Tracy Wiegner.
Aloha! Mahalo for inviting me to be part of this session to talk about shifts in carbon export from a Hawaiian watershed due to climate change. But before I give you some more details about our project, I'd like to give a big mahalo to our research team. This is a picture from a November visit where the Alaska folks came to Hawaii, and we gave them a tour of the Wailuku River watershed, which is the river that I'll be speaking about today. And that's where Walter's head came from backwards. So I was taking all the pictures, so I'm not in any of them. So I'd like to first place our research in the context of climate change. As the atmosphere is warming from increased greenhouse gases, it is changing the hydrological cycle. This is affecting global rainfall patterns. In general, wet areas tend to be getting wetter and dry areas tend to be getting drier. This is and will continue to affect the export of materials from watersheds to coastal waters. One important export from rivers to coastal waters is carbon. We need accurate estimates of carbon sources and sinks for management actions. We want to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. And we also want to store carbon, long-term carbon storage, both on land and the ocean. One of our gaps in knowledge in this larger picture is carbon export from small, steep, tropical island watersheds to the ocean. These watersheds, as well as others, are important in exporting carbon to the ocean, and this carbon supports coastal ecosystems. Tropical high island rivers are understudied. They are small and steep, rapid export to coastal waters, and therefore have a high land-sea connectivity. One area in the world where we have a lot of the tropical high islands is Oceania. So while this region only comprises a small percentage of the land on Earth, it's responsible for 33% of the total sediment input to the ocean, as well as 21 to 38% of the total organic carbon export. Oceania is also a region that has been shown to have the highest on regional per area of dissolved organic carbon export. Hence, this region is important to study, not only for understanding the organic matter going into the ocean and supporting coastal ecosystems, but we need to understand how this export will change with changes in rainfall patterns due to climate change and how that will affect the receiving downstream ecosystems. One great location in Oceania to study how changes in precipitation patterns will affect the export of carbon from rivers is Hawaii. In Hawaii, it is predicted that we will have an increase in storm frequencies, as well as the rainfall intensity and amount. However, between these storm events, we're going to have longer periods of drought. And so what we're going to see is that there's going to be a greater difference in river discharge between base and storm flow conditions. This is going to affect the timing of the material to the coastal waters, the amount of material going into them, and also potentially the quality, affecting the overall productivity of these coastal waters. For our project, we had several questions. The first is, how does river discharge affect carbon export? 2, what are the carbon sources to the river during base and storm flow conditions? How will this be altered with changes in precipitation patterns? And finally, how will these changes affect downstream coastal ecosystems? For today, I'm just going to be focusing on our first question. Our study focused on the Wailuku River watershed. This is located on Hawaii Island on the windward side. It is the largest watershed in the state of Hawaii. It drains both Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa volcanoes into Hilo Bay. Its land cover is primarily native forest, but we do have a smaller portion of pasture and urban land towards the mouth of the river. Our area has a wet and dry season with rainfall range about 2,700 millimeters near the coastline and up to 7,600 millimeters in the upper watershed. In Hawaiian, Wailuku means waters of destruction. And you can see from some of the earlier pictures and ones I'll show you later on that it is correctly named for the amount of water that can come down. Here's a picture of our sample site, the first showing base flow conditions, the second one showing storm flow conditions. And just note that the water discharge during storm flow conditions can be much, much higher than what's shown in this picture. So to answer our question, we collected 50 water samples from August 2021 through December 2022. Discharge ranged from 0.23 to 134 cubic meters per second. We quantified the concentrations of carbon species, dissolved inorganic carbon, DIC, dissolved organic carbon, DOC, fine particulate organic carbon, FPOC, and coarse particulate organic carbon, CPOC. We took these concentrations of the different carbon species and entered them into the USGS load estimator model to estimate the export of these carbon species from our river during our sample period. This is a picture showing discharge in blue during our study and comparing it to the monthly discharge over the 20-year average. And what you can see is during our study period, we had much greater variability in river discharge in both directions. We had very high discharge in October, December, and May. And for a large portion of our study, it was fairly dry. And in fact, we were in a drought condition, which is highly unusual for Hilo, which is known for its rain. One of the things we noticed in the stream during dry conditions is we saw a buildup of materials both in the watershed and in the stream. And when a storm came, particularly after a dry period, really? Okay. we would see a large export, especially on the rising hydrograph, of parameters like FPOC. This is a picture showing the buildup of 12 days prior to a storm event. One of the other things that was building up in the stream was filamentous algae, and this is a large component of the coarse particular material, both during base flow and storm flow conditions. For the carbon export, we saw the dissolved organic carbon concentrations decrease with discharge. What this means is that the river water coming into the estuary has less acid neutralizing abilities, decreasing the buffering capacity of the coastal waters to ocean acidification. In contrast, we saw dissolved organic carbon concentrations increase, likely to the change in the flow paths going from groundwater moving up through the soil profile and flushing out that material that has accumulated during those dry periods. Similarly, we saw a similar pattern for FPOC, likely from soil erosion due to overland flow, stream bed scouring during storms, and the physical breakdown of CPOC. What was interesting is that the CPCO concentration the composition didn't really differ between base flow and storm flow. The primary components of it were leaves, primary albizia and African tulip, and also a filamentous algae. One thing that's really different about our streams compared to Alaska is we had no aquatic or terrestrial animals in our drift nets. So the total carbon export did vary by month. We saw a higher export during our wet months. And we also saw that the composition of the carbon being export changed. DIC and FPOC were most variable. DIC concentrations were higher during base flow. FPOC concentrations were higher during high flow. And DOC concentrations were fairly constant between the different discharge conditions. So just to conclude, DOC and FPOC concentrations increase with discharge. DIC decreases with increasing discharge. What form is the largest part of the export? Well, that depends on discharge. It's DIC during base flow and FPOC during storms. Our next steps are to figure out the sources, where they come from, do they change during base flow conditions, and how all these things might differ with future precipitation patterns. And lastly, future studies, we want to look at what are the implications for the receiving downstream estuaries. So stay tuned and we'll tell you more about how our systems are similar and different to Alaska. Mahalo.
Thank you so much, Tracy. We have time for one quick question before we move on to our next talk.
Hi, I'm Catherine Smith. I'm actually from the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, and we have Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands in our region. And I'm actually worked in Puerto Rico a long time ago, looking at a really similar issue, looking at the effects of freshwater diversion on estuarine fish communities and food webs. And one of the interesting things was with the freshwater shrimp, the diadromous species played a huge component of the organic matter contribution. Is actually all almost always marine derived contributions to the food web, but a lot of diadromous species and larvae from freshwater shrimp that were contributing to the food web. So I was just curious if I heard correctly that there is not a lot of, you're not finding a lot of organisms in the samples you're taking. You're not finding a lot of.
Well, that is true. So the Hawaii island chain is the most isolated in the world. And we don't have things that break down coarse particulate organic matter like you find on continental streams, like the shredders. We have some that may have been introduced, like some of the non-native shrimp. We're not sure if they're shredders or they like the algae. So it's a very different kind of system. We don't have a lot of organisms in our streams, it's particularly insects.
Okay, oh, that's interesting.
All right. Thank you very much, Tracy. Thank you very much, Jason. So our next pair of talks, again, building on this theme of learning from one another in Alaska and the Pacific Islands are going to focus on developing climate projections to inform natural resource management. So first, you're going to hear from Rick Lader from University of Alaska Fairbanks, and then we're going to follow up with a talk from Tom Giambelluca from here at Manoa. So Rick.
There we go. Aloha. This is my first time visiting the state of Hawaii, so it's nice to be here, and thank you, Brad, for providing this nice lay. I don't have a very bright shirt, as you can see, but I'll work on that. As Steve noted, my name is Rick Lader. I am with the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is hosted at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And today I'll be talking about a project that I've been leading, looking at modeling future precipitation regimes to inform resource management. And this has been a joint project between the Pacific Islands and Alaska CASC networks. So as Steve laid out earlier, we have Alaska and we have Hawaii, and these seem like very disparate locations, right? They're very far away. But when we talk about climatic changes and ecosystem changes, we have a lot of shared challenges, right? In Alaska, and for this study, I was talking about Southeast Alaska, we have the Icefield-to-Ocean ecosystem. And here in Hawaii, we refer to it as the Ridge-to-Reef. But in both of these ecosystems, we have very steep terrain gradients. And because of this, we also have very extreme precipitation gradients. Just to give you an idea of that, we have some maps here of mean annual rainfall with Southeast Alaska on the top left and the Hawaiian Islands on the bottom right. And we can see that over a very short distance, we go from very little in the way of mean annual rainfall to upwards of thousands of millimeters per year. And another issue that we have is scarcity of data coverage, both in situ instrumentation, and my background is in atmospheric sciences. So we also have a dearth of high resolution climate model information to resolve these landscapes. Because as we know, the changes are not always uniform and can certainly vary as you go from one elevation to the next. So quickly, here's the core team that I've been working with on this project. Tom will be following up after my talk with the Hawaii side of things. Many of you probably know Abby or Zhao, and Molly also is here somewhere in the audience, right there. So wonderful people to work with. Okay, so as many of you are probably aware, although possibly not, I'm not sure how many people in the audience have visited Alaska before, but long-term trends for the state are for warmer and wetter conditions. And these two maps are showing long-term trends for temperature on the left-hand side and precipitation on the right-hand side over a 50-year period from 1969 through 2018. And this is from a 2019 publication. But in each case, every single climate division, which is the delineations on the map, showed substantial warming and wetting over this period. Of course, today, this study was focusing on Southeast Alaska, and here also very substantial warming and wetting over this 50-year period. The only thing I'll note here is if you look at the temperature trends, you'll see, of course, over Northwest Alaska, the magnitude of these trends are higher, but that's a function of loss of Arctic sea ice. But the changes are no less substantial over Southeast Alaska. Of course, I just talked about warming and wetting conditions, so the next slide is about drought. And Southeast Alaska has had a tremendous 4 or 5 year period of variability when it comes to precipitation. And the image on the right-hand side is showing the standardized precipitation index. And it's just a measure of how dry it is basically. And we can see that extreme drought, first extreme drought classification in Southeast Alaska history, peaking in the summer of 2019. You'll also note from this time series, which goes all the way back to 1925, that indeed there have been dry periods in the past, not quite as dry as what happened culminating in 2019, but it's the long-term warming that's superimposed on these dry conditions that are really altering the impacts, for example, with municipal water restrictions. And in Southeast Alaska, many of the communities depend on hydropower to generate their electricity. And during the dry period, particularly during 2019, a lot of this hydropower production had to be shut down. So that was summer of 2019, but this was followed in late fall 2020 by unprecedented precipitation across parts of Southeast Alaska. Here we're looking at an image from Haines, Alaska, which is actually kind of in the northern panhandle region of Southeast Alaska. But in December 2020, on December 2nd, Haines received over 6.5 inches of rainfall. And during the first week of December, almost 15 inches, causing a ton of impacts, including the landslide that you see going across the highway and in loss of life also during this event. And this is, as many of you are familiar with in the news lately, from an atmospheric river. And so those have large impacts over Southeast Alaska. So observationally, we can see that these heavy precipitation events have been increasing. These are just 2 time series from Juneau, Alaska. And on the left-hand side, it's just the time series of number of days with at least 1/2 inch precipitation during the year. And on the right-hand side is for Juneau also, about days with at least 1 inch. And going from 1944 all the way through 2022, we can see a very clear, significant trend in this case for both metrics. And 2022 was the wettest year of record, both annually and in terms of the number of 1/2 inch days, 65. So that's over 2 months of the year you had at least 1/2 inch of precipitation. And it makes me glad that I'm actually in Fairbanks and not in Juneau. Yeah. So I've talked a lot about observational data, but of course we're always interested in what's going to happen in the future. And for the future, we have to rely on model representations. The problem with Southeast Alaska and Hawaii in many cases is that we can't just rely on global climate models. These climate models often have spatial resolutions on the order of 2.5 degree by 2.5 degree resolution, which is the grid that you see on the left-hand side here. The problem is that if you look in one grid box, like the Juneau grid box, in this one grid box, you'll go from the ocean to a temperate rainforest where you're getting all that precipitation up to very high elevation ice fields. So in the climate model, you're going to get one value for temperature, for precipitation, for snow, for wind. And clearly that is insufficient. So for local information, you often require downscaling of the climate model, the coarser scale. And that's been a lot of the work I've been doing, a process called dynamical downscaling, where we take that coarse scale information and put it onto a much finer grid. So I'll just quickly go through a couple results from a 4-kilometer dynamically downscale data set that I produced for Southeast Alaska that has historical representations and future projections. Here we're looking at some mid-century projections of mean precipitation on the left-hand side and 99th percentile, so extreme precipitation on the right. And as I noted earlier, the observed trend of annual rainfall is slightly increasing, right? And so we see that with more in the way of greens on the map on the left-hand side, as opposed to browns, which would be drying. But then when we look at the extremes on the right-hand side, it's a very clear story. The extremes are projected to continue to increase in this region. Similarly, set of maps for snowfall. The browns here are just showing projections of mid-century snowfall across the region. And to no surprise, we have significant loss of snowfall across this area. And on the right-hand side, we're just looking at, because we have the higher resolution data, we can start to look at changes by elevation bins, right? So the x-axis on the right image is showing terrain height going from the sea level all the way up to the high elevation glaciers. And then the y-axis is just showing percent change projected, where the 0 line would be no change, and then everything below it is a loss of snowfall. So last slide before I'm going to hand it off to Tom, who's going to give you the Hawaii side of the story. But a large part of this project has been translating the dynamical downscale data that have been produced, trying to make them more accessible. So things like creating summaries of historical and projected temperature, snowfall, precipitation in formats that are actually accessible to people to just grab and go. And I've also been creating kind of modules to help people access the data in their preferred programming languages. And of course, there are other scientific publications and whatnot. But with that, I'm going to hand it off to Tom. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick. Aloha, everyone. I'm Tom Giambelluca from University of Hawaii. And my group and I have been doing work on climate change, historical changes in climate in Hawaii for a long time. We've also been looking at future changes by downscaling future model output from GCMs and analyzing downscaling products that have been done by others. So just looking at the changes that we've experienced, Hawaii is also warming, we would say rapidly, not as rapidly as Alaska, but certainly is warming rapidly for a tropical location in the middle of the ocean. And we have found recently in work that was led by Aurora Kagawa-Viviani in the graph on the left there, that at sea level, our air temperature is increasing pretty rapidly. And we've known for some time that the highest elevation temperatures are also increasing rapidly. And it turns out the area in the middle is not increasing very fast. And there's the apparent reason for that has to do with a shift in the cloud base, which may not be obvious why, but does also have an effect on temperature. So that's kind of countering the large scale warming effect. On the right, you see work by Abby Fraser, who really should be here giving this talk. Abby's not able to be here because she's now a professor at Clark University. But what you see there are the patterns of temperature change over approximately the past century for annual wet season and dry season periods. And what you see there is dominantly drying throughout almost the entire state, and the significant and high magnitude drying trends are found primarily on the western part of the Big Island and in other areas, of each island. So there are some significant drying areas on each island. So for Hawaii, I would say, unlike Alaska, which is also warming, we're warming, but instead of getting wetter, we're getting drier. This drying trend in the means is also showing up in the extremes. And there has been a significant change and increase in the frequency, duration, and severity of droughts in Hawaii. That goes along with that change in the mean. What's shown here is another analysis by Abby that is specific to a 6-year drought, very severe, long drought that we had from 2007 to 2012, which affected almost the entire state. And what's shown is depicting the duration, the number of drought months within that period, and the severity of the drought for each location. You see it's pretty widespread and pretty severe. At the same time that we've been having general drying and worse droughts, longer droughts, more frequent droughts, we've also been experiencing what I would say are unprecedented high rainfall events. And while I don't have an analysis of the statistical trends to show you, and there have been some analyses done, and I would say mostly there's not really firm conclusions yet about detecting changes in high intensity rainfall, but we can say that we have had some unprecedented events recently. So for example, what's shown here are 2 events in 2018. One on the left is an event that affected the northern part of Kauai, the Halilea, Moku, as well as parts of Oahu and other islands, but most severely in that Hanalei area of Kauai. During that event, there was one particular rain gauge at Waipa that had a verified 24-hour rainfall of 49.7 inches, and that is now standing as the United States record for 24-hour rainfall. So it doesn't take a hydrologist to know that that caused a lot of problems that people are still digging out of at present. So it affected agricultural areas, affected people's homes, affected infrastructure, and displaced people, and had really severe impacts. A few months later, we had a close brush with a Category 5 hurricane, Hurricane Lane, that rounded South Point on the Big Island and then slowed down and sat there for a while as it decreased a little bit in intensity and drove huge rainfall amounts on the Big Island. And we have gauge amounts as high as 57 inches in 4 days. And we have estimates that for other areas that go as high as 100 inches in 4 days. So that, again, another very high-end event. And I should mention at the same time this was going on, we were experiencing catastrophic fires on Maui. Okay, so what we've been doing in this project is to take data from a dynamical downscaling effort done by Chun-Shi Zhang here at the University of Hawaii a few years back using CMIP-5 data and the pseudo-global warming approach to dynamical downscaling, and doing some work just to get those data sets into forms that could be more readily analyzed, such as converting them to geotiffs, standardizing the spatial resolution and the projection, the map projection that's used, and standardizing the time steps and so forth. But one of the big things that needs to be done here is what we call bias correction. So it turns out that dynamical downscaling often produces results that are pretty strongly biased if you compare a present day downscaling to present day observations. And so what's shown on the right are those differences. This is a map showing the dynamical downscaling of rainfall for kind of present day conditions, which is actually for the period of 1990 to 2009, minus the observed pattern for that same period. And as you can see there on the Big Island, it can be off by more than 100 inches on the plus side. And if you see that spot pointed out on Maui, can be off by as much as more than 100 inches on the low side. So there are these big biases that need to be corrected if we're going to make use of this kind of data. So we've done that kind of work, and we've used it to produce maps of the percent change, the absolute change, and then the future mean patterns of rainfall. So these biases in the dynamical downscaling might be partly responsible for another issue that we've encountered. And I think anybody here that's paying attention to downscaled rainfall for Hawaii is aware that we have primarily two different types of downscaling. We have the dynamical downscaling. We also have statistical downscaling, and the primary products from those don't agree very well. So this is comparing the percent change in annual rainfall for the RCP 8.5 scenario, end of century. On the left is the statistical downscaling done by a group that I work with. And on the right is the dynamical downscaling from Chun-Shi's work. And you see that the patterns are quite different. We can even look at the areas where those two projections at least agree in sign. And you see that even within those areas, the patterns are quite different. And notice the white areas there. Those are all areas where these two projections do not even agree in sign. Okay, so what we're doing is we're taking percent change maps, and we're applying that to observed patterns to get the absolute change for the future projection. And then we're adding that to the present day observed rainfall to get the future rainfall maps. And we're doing the same thing for the dynamical downscaling. And this is shown for the statistical downscaling, but we're doing the same thing for dynamical downscaling. And that allows us to produce a bias corrected result. So we do that for annual and for the wet and dry seasons. And we're doing it for RCP 4.5 and 8.5 for end of century projections. And so just very quickly, this is my last slide. We're also, our primary objective here is to look at extreme rainfall. We're just getting started on that. And what we've done so far is to look at the dry end. And what you see is a graph of a time series for the present with dynamical downscaling, and then that same time series projected for the future end of century. And this is projected using SPI 12, which is a drought index, standard precipitation index, and it shows how much that drought, which is occurring in the middle of the period in the historical, and how much bigger it is projected to be in the future. We're going to do something similar for the high intensity rainfall. We'll have to do that with daily rainfall. This is all done with monthly. So we're going to be doing bias corrections of the daily rainfall and analyzing high extremes after that. So that's all I have for today. And if we have any time, I think Rick and I can answer some questions.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think we have time for one question. All right,